Have you ever walked into a store, caught someone doing something wrong, and expected the worst, only to witness something you never could have imagined? Something that made you stop, rethink everything, and question how you see the world? That's what today's story is about. But listen closely, because what starts as a simple case of shoplifting quickly turns into a moment that not only shocks everyone inside the store, but sets off a chain of events that changes one young boy's life forever. It's a story that might just change yours too. You came here because of that title, because you saw that a kid got caught stealing food. But here's the part that no one expected: what the store owner did next. I promise, by the end of this video you're going to see why he did it and why it mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Stick with me, because the truth behind this moment will surprise you more than you think. Now, let's be real. We're all guilty of jumping to conclusions. We see a kid slip a candy bar into his hoodie, and immediately we go into judgment mode. Where are his parents? Why is he stealing? Kids these days. But pause for a second. What if I told you there's always more to the story than what meets the eye? That what we think is a simple crime might actually be a silent cry for help. This isn't just about a stolen snack. It's about hunger, survival, and the power of one unexpected act of kindness that turned an ordinary day into something extraordinary. And before you scroll away or think you know how this ends, trust me, this story doesn't go where you expect. It's not about punishment. It's not even about justice. It's about something deeper. Something we all crave, whether we admit it or not. Compassion. Let's take you there, right into that small grocery store tucked between a laundromat and a broken-down gas station on the edge of a struggling neighborhood. You've seen stores like it. Fluorescent lights, faded linoleum floors, a buzzing fridge that never quite shuts up. The kind of place where time feels a little slower and faces become familiar. The store owner, Mr. Daniels, has been running that shop for over 25 years. He's seen it all. Kids coming in with scraped knees and empty pockets, moms on their last dollar, folks just trying to get by. He's no fool. He keeps his eye on the shelves and knows when something's missing. But on this one chilly Thursday afternoon, something happened that even he wasn't prepared for. It was around 4:30 p.m., after school rush. A few regulars were wandering the aisles. A man in a work vest grabbed a six-pack and a microwave dinner. An elderly woman was counting quarters for a bag of rice. But in the corner near the canned soups, a skinny kid with worn-out sneakers and a jacket 2 sizes too big was doing something else. His eyes darted back and forth, not looking for flavor, but for a chance. He wasn't browsing. He was scanning for security cameras, for workers, for witnesses. Then, in one swift move, he grabbed a small loaf of bread and a bag of trail mix and shoved them into his jacket. His heart was racing. His hands were trembling. He headed toward the exit, quiet, quick, but not quick enough. Mr. Daniels had seen the whole thing. He didn't yell. He didn't call the cops. Instead, he did something that made everyone in the store freeze. He stepped out from behind the counter, walked up to the boy, and said just one word. "Hey." That was it. Just hey. But the tone, it wasn't angry. It wasn't mean. It wasn't even stern. It was curious. And it was enough to stop the kid in his tracks. He turned around slowly, eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He just looked down, ashamed, scared, maybe even ready to be hit or hauled away. But what happened next made every single person watching question everything they thought they knew about right and wrong. You're probably wondering, who was this kid? Why was he stealing food in the first place? And what did the store owner do that could possibly change his life? Those are the questions that drew you here, and you're going to get every single answer. But I'm going to ask you to do something first. I want you to stay. Not because this is just another dramatic story on the internet, but because this is real. It's raw, and it's relevant. In a country where food insecurity affects over 13 million children every year, and where more families than ever are living paycheck to paycheck, this isn't just a story. This is America's story. And if you've ever wondered how small actions can lead to big changes, this is one you can't afford to skip. Let's talk about the psychology for a moment. Because what happened in that store wasn't just about groceries. It was about dignity. And the truth is, when someone steals food, it's usually not because they're trying to get away with something, they're trying to survive. They're desperate. They're tired of being hungry. They're tired of pretending everything's okay when it's not. The real mystery here isn't the theft. It's what the store owner saw in that kid's eyes that made him act the way he did. Because what he saw wasn't a criminal. It was a reflection of someone who once stood in that same spot, in a different time, facing the same kind of hunger. What Mr. Daniels did wasn't about being a hero. It was about remembering. And that brings us to a bigger question. How do we treat people who have nothing? Do we turn away? Do we punish them? Or do we lean in, ask questions, and offer something more than just judgment? This story dives into all of that, and as we go deeper, you'll meet the people whose lives were impacted by one moment of choice. A store clerk who couldn't believe what she saw. A customer who walked out changed. A boy who had no idea he was about to get more than food. He was about to get a second chance. And just when you think you know where this is heading, you'll find yourself questioning everything again. This video isn't just about a kid and a loaf of bread. It's about what happens when someone chooses to see a person instead of a problem. It's about how a simple act of understanding can echo louder than any punishment. And it's about you, the viewer, because every single one of us has the power to be someone's turning point. You're not just watching a video. You're becoming part of a story that matters. So if you've ever believed that people can change, or if you've ever hoped that kindness still exists in this world, you need to see what happens next. Because what Mr. Daniels did that day didn't just change one life. It sparked something that nobody in that store saw coming. And I guarantee when you see how it all plays out, you'll understand why it had to happen that way. But here's the thing, right when you think you've figured out the ending, right when you think the story is about redemption, something else happens. Something no one in that store saw coming. A twist that flips everything upside down. And it starts with one question the kid finally asks. Why did you help me? Now that's where the story really begins. Mr. Daniels didn't answer the boy's question right away. He simply stared at him for a moment, not with suspicion, but with something far more unsettling for a kid who is used to being ignored. He looked at him with recognition. The kind of recognition that doesn't come from familiarity, but from understanding. The boy, his name was Mason, though nobody had called him that with kindness in a long time, stood frozen, half expecting to be grabbed by the arm or shouted at. Instead, Mr. Daniels gently waved for him to follow. No threats, no cops, no public shaming. Just a quiet gesture that felt stranger than any punishment. Mason hesitated, still clutching the stolen trail mix inside his coat, but his feet moved forward like they had a mind of their own. It wasn't fear guiding him now, it was confusion. As they moved toward the back of the store, the atmosphere shifted. Customers whispered. Some rolled their eyes, assuming the kid would get what he deserved. Others seemed puzzled, watching the store owner disappear behind the swinging door that led to the stockroom, with a shoplifter trailing behind like a shadow. What none of them knew was that Mason hadn't eaten a proper meal in over 2 days. His stomach had stopped growling hours ago. Hunger had given way to something colder, a kind of numbness that only desperate kids understand. The kind you carry with you through every abandoned building, every friend's couch that isn't really offered, every night you sleep with one eye open. Mason had been floating from place to place since early spring. He used to live in a small 2-bedroom apartment with his mom, tucked away behind a laundromat on the east side. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Then one day she didn't come home. Not for dinner, not the next morning, not even by the time he ran out of canned beans and water. No note. No explanation. Just a black purse left on the couch and an eviction notice on the door 2 weeks later. He was 15 when that happened, but his face had always looked older. Maybe that's why no one questioned it when he started showing up alone, at shelters, at dollar stores, or at fast food restaurants where he'd stare at the menu longer than anyone should without ordering. He learned quickly how to go unnoticed, how to steal just enough to get by but not enough to make people mad. But today was different. Mr. Daniels offered Mason a seat on an overturned milk crate next to a stack of dusty paper towels. The back room was quiet, humming only with the sound of the fridge motor and a flickering overhead light. Daniels didn't ask any questions at first. Instead, he poured 2 paper cups of hot cocoa from a thermos that probably hadn't seen action in months. He handed one to Mason without a word. And Mason took it.
Slowly, cautiously,
Like it might disappear if he moved too fast. As they sat in that cramped little room, something started to shift. Not just the silence, but the air itself. Like this wasn't about the food anymore. It was about the story behind it. But whose story exactly still wasn't clear. There's something you should know about Mr. Daniels. He's not just a store owner. At least, not in the way most people imagine. Yeah, he ran the place, stocked the shelves, swept the floors, but he also watched. Not in a creepy way, but with intent. He remembered names, faces, situations. And even though he rarely got involved in people's business, he always noticed when something wasn't right. He'd seen the boy before, once or twice, ducking behind the frozen foods, eyeing the clearance bin near the front. Something about his posture, half defensive, half invisible, had stuck with him. That's why today, when Mason finally crossed that invisible line between thinking about stealing and actually doing it, Daniels wasn't surprised. What surprised him was what he saw in the kid's eyes, a look he recognized from his own past, buried under decades of trying to forget. Mason started talking, but not in the way you'd expect. He didn't confess or explain himself. Instead, he asked something strange. You ever been hungry so long you forget what food tastes like? The question hung in the air, heavier than any apology. Daniels took a slow sip of his cocoa and didn't answer. Not yet.
he didn't need to.
Mason could see it in the way his hand trembled slightly, the way his eyes darkened just for a second before returning to neutral. It was a silent yes. And that unspoken understanding created a bridge between them, one forged not from pity or obligation, but shared experience. But just as things started to feel a little safer, Mason's story took a turn.
He mentioned someone.
A man named Joel said he'd been looking out for him lately. Let him crash on his couch once or twice. Told him which stores didn't have cameras in the back, which alleys to avoid after dark, which cops looked the other way. Joel was older, maybe mid-30s, but acted younger.
Too smooth, too slick.
Said all the right things. Gave Mason a burner phone with no contacts and told him never to answer calls from block numbers. Claimed he used to be just like him, back in the day. Said the system chews up kids like him and spits them out, so he should take what he can while he can. At first, Joel felt like a lifeline. But lately, Mason had started to notice things. The way Joel always had cash but no job. The way he disappeared for days, then showed up in a new jacket, new kicks, and new phone. The way he talked about favors like they were currency. Now, Daniels didn't say it out loud, but something about that name made him uneasy.
Joel.
He'd heard that name before. Years ago. Back when a string of break-ins hit local businesses. Nothing major, just a few missing boxes of supplies, some minor vandalism. But the name Joel kept popping up in conversations behind closed doors. No one could ever prove anything, but everyone had suspicions. That's when Mr. Daniels started to wonder, was Mason really stealing just for himself? Or was someone else pulling the strings? That's the thing about stories like these. There's always more than one layer. Always someone lurking in the background. And while Mason's hunger was very real, so was the growing pressure around him. It wasn't just about food. It was about survival, influence, and a world where loyalty can be weaponized. The more Daniels listened, the more pieces started sliding into place, but not neatly. Some pieces didn't quite fit. Like why Mason hesitated when asked where he was staying, or why he flinched when Daniels offered to call someone for him. It was subtle, but enough to raise doubt. Then came the most curious part. As they talked, Mason's phone buzzed. He didn't reach for it immediately, just stared at it. The screen lit up with a number Daniels couldn't see, but the way Mason's face drained of color told him enough. The kid quickly silenced the call, shoved the phone back into his pocket, and changed the subject. But the damage was done. Daniels clocked the fear. It wasn't the fear of being caught, it was the fear of someone finding out he'd been caught and didn't run. That he sat down. That he talked. That maybe for the first time in weeks he trusted someone. At this point, the tension in that small room was electric. Not from confrontation, but from realization. Daniels knew the kid was in deeper than he admitted, and Mason knew he was running out of places to hide. But still, neither of them said what they were really thinking. Instead, Daniels stood up, walked to a nearby shelf, and pulled down a can of soup and a loaf of fresh bread. "If you're gonna eat," he said, "eat something warm." He heated the soup on a hot plate in the corner, poured it into a cracked ceramic bowl, and slid it over. Mason hesitated, then took a spoonful.
Slowly.
Gratefully. And in that quiet moment, something shifted again. But just as it seemed like they might have found a moment of peace, a knock came at the front door. 3 hard bangs. Not from a customer. Not from a neighbor. A knock with weight.
Purpose.
Daniels froze. Mason stiffened. The knock came again, this time louder, followed by a voice. Low, firm, and unmistakably male. "You in there, kid? Thought I told you not to disappear on me." Daniels locked eyes with Mason, who was now visibly shaking. And just like that, the mystery deepened. Who was really in control here? Who had been watching from the shadows? And what would happen next if that door opened? Now the real story was about to unfold. But one thing was certain, this was no longer just about stolen food. This was about choices, consequences, and the thin line between helping someone and exposing them to even greater danger. And in the next few moments, that line would be tested in a way none of them were ready for. Daniels didn't open the door right away. He moved slowly, deliberately, reaching first to shut off the light in the back room before stepping toward the store's front. The third knock had come faster than the others, more urgent now, like the man on the other side was getting impatient or nervous. Mason sat frozen, his spoon still in midair, steam rising from the soup he no longer had the courage to eat. He'd heard that voice before. Too many times. It was Joel. And when Joel came looking, it usually meant something had gone wrong. Either he needed a favor, or he thought someone owed him. Mason's mind raced with panic, but beneath that was something even worse, shame. For letting someone else fight his battle. For not running when he had the chance. For believing, even for a second, that he could sit and eat like everything was normal. Daniels cracked the door open an inch, just enough to peer out and block the view inside. "We're closed," he said calmly. "Come back tomorrow." A long pause followed. Then Joel's voice, smoother now, almost friendly. "Just here to pick up my nephew. Said he'd be here." Misunderstanding, I'm sure. Daniels didn't flinch, but inside, something twisted. Nephew? That wasn't just a lie, it was a strategic one. Designed to confuse, to create a paper-thin excuse for being there. It gave him just enough plausible deniability if anyone else heard. But Daniels wasn't the average store owner. He could read between the lines. "No kid here," he replied, then closed the door, firmly, but not loudly enough to cause a scene. Mason's breath was shallow, his eyes wide. "He's not my uncle," he whispered, voice cracking. "I never told him I came here. He must have followed me." Daniels stayed silent, walked over, and drew the blinds on the front windows. Mason hadn't noticed the tiny security camera perched above the door, but Daniels had. It recorded everything, usually. But when he went to rewind the feed on the dusty monitor behind the register, something strange happened. The file was missing. Not corrupted. Not damaged.
Gone.
Just a few hours of footage. Vanished from the hard drive like they'd never existed. Daniels stared at the screen, brows furrowed. He didn't say anything to Mason.
Not yet.
But that missing footage told him more than he wanted to admit. Back in the stockroom, Mason picked at the soup while Daniels quietly slipped out to the back alley and placed a call. Not to the police. He knew how easily this could spiral out of control. One wrong move, and the kid could vanish for good. Instead, he called someone he hadn't spoken to in years. A woman named Carla, who used to work child services before she resigned under strange circumstances. Rumors floated around that she'd crossed a line trying to protect a teen from an abusive foster home. Whatever the truth was, she disappeared from public records shortly after. Daniels only kept her number out of respect. But now he needed someone who understood how the system really worked, someone who wouldn't just write Mason off as another troubled kid. When Carla answered, her voice was distant and cautious. Daniels explained what happened, gave her Joel's name. There was a long pause. Then she said something that chilled him. "I know that name. He's not just some street hustler, Rick. He's a scout. Works with a ring that moves kids through small towns like pawns. They pick ones who slip through the cracks, runaways, orphans, kids off the grid. Promise them safety, then use them to run errands. Some worse than others. And once they're in, they don't get out." Daniels hung up, shaken. Meanwhile, Mason had found something in his coat pocket that he didn't recognize. A folded piece of paper. No note, just a small printed address, scribbled in ink on the back of a fast food receipt. It wasn't his handwriting. It wasn't there earlier. And yet somehow it was. Daniels looked at it and felt a pit open in his stomach. The address was in a nearby industrial zone, mostly warehouses and old auto shops. The kind of place no one would look for a missing teen. He asked Mason if Joel gave it to him. Mason shook his head, baffled.
No, I swear.
It wasn't there when I left the shelter last night. Why would he sneak it into my pocket? That question hovered in the air like smoke, dark and suffocating. Either Joel was setting a trap, or someone else was trying to help. But which was it? And why now? Daniels made a plan. Tomorrow they'd go together, cautiously. Maybe drive past the place, scope it out. But that night, as Mason curled up in the back room with a blanket and old pillow, Daniels locked every door twice and watched the security feed like a hawk. And just before midnight, something strange appeared on the screen. A figure in a hoodie, standing at the edge of the lot, staring straight at the camera. Not Joel.
Too small, too still.
The figure didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. Then, as quickly as they appeared, they turned and vanished into the darkness. The next morning, Mason woke up to find a note slid under the stockroom door. A single line written in shaky pen, "You're looking in the wrong place." But there was no name, no return address, and no one had seen who left it. So now, the question wasn't just what Joel wanted or who Mason could trust. It was who else was watching. And why. 2 towns over, in a crumbling apartment complex on the edge of a forgotten neighborhood, a teenage girl named Lila sat in her kitchen thumbing through a grocery list that didn't quite match what she'd brought home. She had just enough to make it through the week, barely, canned beans, off-brand pasta, half a loaf of white bread, and 2 apples bruised beyond belief. But tucked between the receipt and the coupon flyers in her shopping bag was something she didn't recognize, a strip of paper, folded into fourths, marked with the same address Mason had found. Same handwriting. Same fast food receipt back. Her stomach twisted before her mind even had time to process what it meant. Lila hadn't spoken to Mason in over 6 months, not since he'd left the shelter, without warning. They had once shared everything, stories, dreams, trauma. She thought he was long gone, maybe in another state, maybe worse. And now, this? Either someone was playing games with her, or something was happening in the shadows she couldn't ignore. Lila took the note to her neighbor, a retired nurse named Bonnie who used to volunteer at the youth center before funding cuts shut it down. Bonnie squinted at the receipt, flipped it over, then walked into her closet and pulled down an old shoebox. Inside were a dozen similar scraps she had quietly collected over the past few years. Receipts, candy wrappers, torn matchbooks, all with coded addresses scribbled in the same jittery pen. Most of the places no longer existed, burned down, condemned, or mysteriously abandoned. But this one hadn't yet made the news. Bonnie looked at Lila with an expression that was more fear than concern. "Someone's moving fast again," she whispered. "And I think they're tying up loose ends." Back in the store, Mason sat at the counter with Daniels, poring over the strange note and debating whether to drive to the warehouse. But the more they discussed it, the more conflicted Daniels became. If someone went out of their way to say, "You're looking in the wrong place," then what was the right place? Why plan a note only to mislead them? Unless the real secret wasn't about where Joel was headed, but what he had already done. Daniels wasn't used to being one step behind. It gnawed at him. He made a snap decision and grabbed the keys off the hook. "Let's go," he muttered, but before they made it to the car, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. No caller ID. He let it ring. Then a second buzz, this time a message. No words, just a photo. It was grainy, dark, but unmistakable. Mason, walking into Daniel's store 2 nights ago. The angle was from across the street, through a rain-smeared windshield. Someone had been watching them the entire time. Daniel stopped dead in his tracks. "We're being followed," he said, and Mason's heart sank into his stomach. Someone doesn't want us poking around. Or worse, they do, but only to see how much we already know. At that very moment, Lila texted Mason from a burner phone she'd kept hidden for emergencies. It was their old code, a series of emojis they used back in the shelter when speaking in front of staff wasn't safe. Mason read it and froze. "We're not the only ones. Check the blue mailbox by the fire station." That was their old dead drop location. Used to be nothing but notes about who had extra blankets or who'd found a place to crash for the night.
But now?
If Lila was using it again, something real was going down. Daniels drove them both in silence, eyes constantly scanning the rearview mirror for any signs of a tail. At the fire station, Mason sprinted to the blue mailbox and popped the hatch. Inside wasn't a letter, it was a worn-out flip phone, screen cracked but still functional. And next to it, a photograph folded into fourths, like a paper secret. He opened it slowly. It was a group photo of 4 kids, him, Lila, and 2 others from the shelter who'd vanished months ago and were never found. But someone had circled one of the faces in red ink, Derek. The kid who had supposedly aged out of the system and gone north for a factory job. Everyone believed it. Staff, case workers, even Daniels. But the circle around his face came with a single, handwritten word below it, liar. Back at the store, Daniels used an old contact to trace the flip phone's number. Within minutes, he had a list of past locations where it had ping cell towers. One of them matched the industrial zone. Another matched a nursing home that had been shut down last year. But the third location was the most disturbing, the youth shelter itself. Logged just 3 days earlier, after Mason had left. Lila, meanwhile, got a visit of her own. A man in a maintenance jacket knocked on her door claiming to check the pipes. When she hesitated to open it, he muttered something under his breath that chilled her. "You really shouldn't be asking questions, sweetheart. Not unless you want to end up like Derek." She never opened the door. She just backed away slowly, locked every bolt, and waited until she was sure he'd gone. Then she grabbed her backpack, stuffed it with every clue she had, and headed for Daniel's store. Whatever was happening, she wasn't going to let Mason face it alone. But even as they reunited, even as the evidence piled up, nothing added up quite right. Who was running this operation? What did they want from kids who had nothing to offer but fear and silence? Why had the surveillance footage vanished? Who dropped the note? Who sent the photo? Was Joel really the villain? Or just another pawn in something much, much bigger? And most importantly, if Derek never left the shelter, where was he now? The night air was thick with humidity as Mason, Lila, and Daniels stood silently outside the back entrance of the old hardware store, the only place they felt safe enough to regroup. The street was empty, but it didn't feel deserted. It felt watched. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that ever since they found that flip phone, a clock had started ticking. Not metaphorically, literally. Because when Daniels powered it on again, a countdown began flashing on the screen. No context, no audio, no message. Just numbers steadily dropping. 47 hours. 39 minutes. 17 seconds. They tried every way to reset it or dig into its files, but it was locked tighter than a safe, as if designed to deliver only one thing, pressure. That's when Mason's paranoia truly began to claw its way up his spine. This wasn't random. This wasn't some vagrant's trail of crumbs. This was a trap, a setup, a live wire that someone was daring them to grab. The worst part was how quickly it all began to unravel. The very next morning, Daniel's store didn't open. He had promised to meet Mason and Lila there by 9, but when they arrived, the door was ajar and the lights were still flickering from the night before. Daniels was gone. Not a note, not a phone call, nothing. His car was still parked 2 blocks away, keys in the ignition, like he'd stepped out for a minute and never came back. The safe under the register had been opened, but not forced. Whoever did it knew the combination. Mason stood behind the counter, staring down at a single bullet left beside the register, resting on top of Daniel's old employee manual. No blood. No scuffle. Just that bullet. Like someone had walked in calmly and left a message that couldn't be misunderstood. Lila panicked first. "We need to go to the police," she whispered, but even as she said it, Mason could see the hesitation in her eyes. They both knew how that would go. The police had already ignored the missing reports from the shelter. They didn't chase down leads about lost kids, and they certainly weren't going to open an investigation based on a burner phone, a countdown, and a disappearing store owner. Mason knew it in his gut. Whatever this was, it was too carefully buried, too intentionally designed to fall beneath the radar. This wasn't chaos. It was precision. But the real shift, the moment that turned Mason from cautious to terrified, came that night when he returned to the tiny one-room studio where he'd been crashing for the past few weeks. The door was unlocked. Nothing was missing. Except one thing, the drawing. A torn page from his sketchbook that he'd made weeks earlier, of him and Joel laughing in front of a fast food place. A memory they never talked about, but one he held close. That page was gone, replaced by something new. On the wall, taped directly above his mattress, was a printed photograph of the same scene, but altered. Joel's face had been scratched out completely with black ink, and across the bottom in block letters was one line: "Some ghosts don't stay dead." He staggered backward, pulse thundering in his ears. Someone had been inside. Not to rob him. Not to hurt him. Just to let him know they could. Mason scanned the room for cameras, bugs, anything, but found nothing. That was somehow worse. They weren't monitoring him. They were already ahead of him, watching his every step and only showing their presence when it mattered most. Lila, who was crashing on a cot in the corner, noticed the photo too. She said nothing at first, just stared at it in a silence that seemed to stretch out endlessly. But eventually, she whispered, "We were never meant to survive this, were we?" That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the building, every car door outside, every buzz from a phone or flicker of a street lamp was loaded with new meaning. Mason lay awake, heart racing, replaying every memory he had of Joel, of Derek, of the shelter, of Daniels. Questions flooded his mind like static. Was Derek ever really adopted? What if Joel had found out something big? What if Daniels wasn't taken but ran because he knew what was coming? And worst of all, what if the real target had never been Joel or Derek? What if the target was him? The next day, just before dawn, they received another message, this time slipped under the door. A photocopy of a newspaper article from 6 years ago. The headline read, "Local shelter receives major private donation from anonymous source." In the photo was the old director of the shelter, beaming and shaking hands with a man whose face had been sloppily blurred. But scribbled across the top in red marker was a note that made Mason's blood run cold. "Follow the money, and you'll find the bodies." And just like that, the mystery deepened. This wasn't about missing kids anymore. This was about something institutional. Something with money, power, and reach. Suddenly, the missing footage made sense. So did the notes, the surveillance, and the coded messages. Someone had been using the shelter for something darker than either of them could imagine, and now they were closer to the truth than anyone had ever gotten before. But before they could act on any of it, something else vanished. Lila. She had stepped outside for just a minute, to get air, she said. Mason waited 10, 20, 30 minutes. Then a full hour. He walked the block, circled the building, asked a neighbor. Nothing. She was gone. No note. No message. Just a single sneaker left by the door, like a breadcrumb Mason couldn't follow. For the first time since this nightmare began, Mason felt truly alone. The city had never felt so still. For hours, Mason wandered the narrow alleyways and empty backlots that once felt familiar, but now pulsed with shadows and questions. Every corner he turned, every glance behind his shoulder, he hoped to see Lila. But deep down, Something had already told him she was gone. Not missing.
Taken.
Or worse, maybe she had never really been with him in the first place. That idea, that poisonous little seed, had been creeping into his mind ever since the phone call came through. Not from Lila's number. From the old flip phone. The one with the countdown. The timer had stopped ticking. And in its place was a single image, a photograph from the shelter's archives. One he'd never seen before. It was blurry, taken from behind a curtain or a partially open door. But there, plain as day, were 3 boys lined up in the hallway, each holding a manila envelope in hand. And at the center of them was Mason, 12 years old, wide-eyed. And standing right next to him, hand on his shoulder like a guardian angel, was a woman who looked uncannily like Lila. The photo was dated 11 years ago. Everything shifted in that moment. The ground didn't feel solid anymore. The memories he trusted, the events he thought he knew, they all began to warp like heat waves over concrete. How could Lila have been there? She told him she arrived at the shelter long after he had aged out. She said she never even met Joel or Derek. But there she was, in the background of a file that someone wanted him to find, someone who was orchestrating all of this from behind a curtain. Mason sat frozen in place, the phone slipping from his hand. And that's when the knock came. Not a pounding or a bang, just 3 soft knocks on the metal back door of the storage unit where he'd holed up. It wasn't Lila. It was a man in a charcoal gray coat, bald, middle-aged, wearing aviators despite the dim light. He introduced himself as Nolan, no last name, and claimed he used to work with Daniels. Said they were in a group together that tried to expose corruption in city-run institutions, including the shelter. Said that's why Daniels disappeared. But Mason wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on the patch sewn inside Nolan's coat, barely visible, a faded emblem he recognized from the old donation receipts in the shelter's office. That same anonymous foundation that donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to protect the city's forgotten youth. Mason remembered how Daniels once said that money came with strings. And Nolan? Nolan had just walked through the door, holding a pair of scissors. He didn't threaten. He didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he laid out a chilling truth that broke Mason open like glass under a tire. The shelter wasn't just corrupt, it was part of a covert research operation. Kids weren't being adopted. They were being placed. Selected for different reasons: genetic markers, social patterns, behavioral traits. It was all part of a government-funded behavioral study masked as outreach. Mason wasn't chosen by accident. Neither was Joel. Neither was Derek. And Lila? She wasn't one of them. She had been working with Nolan, an embedded monitor. Her job had been to keep tabs on Mason, to guide his development, to watch how he responded to stress, trauma, abandonment. She'd been trained to build trust, and then pull it away at the right moment, to see how he reacted to betrayal. But here was the twist Nolan didn't expect. Lila had broken protocol. She'd gotten too close. She told Mason things she wasn't supposed to. Protected him when she should have reported him.
And now?
She was being punished. Or maybe she ran. Either way, she'd compromised the project, and Nolan had been sent to contain the fallout. Mason didn't move. He couldn't. Everything about his life, his friendships, his losses, the pain, the confusion, it had all been shaped, manipulated. He wasn't a survivor.
He was a subject.
A lab rat in a maze designed by people who believed they had the right to play God. But Nolan wasn't done. He reached into his coat and pulled out a USB drive, tossing it onto the floor. "Everything you need to see is on there," he said quietly. "Proof. Files. Surveillance logs. Video feeds. You were never forgotten, Mason. You were watched. Every second of your life." And with that, Nolan walked out. Mason sat there, unable to breathe, staring at the small, silver drive. His hands trembled as he picked it up. This was the key, the answers he had chased, the truth buried beneath layers of lies. But it was also something darker. Because now, with one flash drive, Mason wasn't just the hunted anymore. He was the only one left who could expose the entire operation. But the question burned in his chest like wildfire. Did he want to? Mason didn't sleep that night. He sat in the corner of the cold storage unit, eyes locked on the single USB drive like it was a ticking bomb. The walls seemed to breathe around him, pulling in the heat and exhaling something colder than air. He could feel it, the weight of what this drive represented. Not just answers, not just truth, but judgment. Whatever was on it could burn entire institutions to the ground, but it could also destroy him. Everything he'd tried to rebuild, every moment of fragile peace he'd carved out from a life of chaos, it all hinged on what he would do next. His phone buzzed, vibrating across the concrete floor, and the name flashing on the screen stopped his heart. Joel. Mason hadn't spoken to Joel in months, not since they'd both stormed out of Daniel's funeral in silence, not since Joel had accused him of clinging to dead-end theories and sabotaging any shot at moving on. But now, in the middle of the night, Joel was calling. Mason hesitated, then answered. Joel's voice was panicked, frantic. He said someone had broken into his apartment, torn through drawers, ripped open the vents. They didn't steal anything, at least nothing valuable. But they took every photo of the shelter, every notebook, even a toy they once kept on the windowsill from back when they were kids. Joel didn't understand why someone would want that unless Mason had been right all along. Mason tried to explain everything, the photo, the USB, Nolan, but Joel cut him off. I need to see you.
Now.
Mason agreed, but something in his gut twisted. He couldn't shake the thought that Joel was hiding something, or worse, that someone was using him to get to Mason. Still, they agreed to meet at an old diner they used to go to on Sundays after church, back before the world broke apart. Mason arrived first. He sat at the back booth, facing the door, USB drive in his pocket, like a loaded gun. But Joel wasn't alone. A woman walked in behind him.
Tall. Red jacket.
Blonde hair. Mason recognized her instantly, even though he hadn't seen her in over a decade. Her name was Claire, Daniel's former assistant at the shelter. The one who suddenly left without explanation just before the investigation into the shelter's finances began. Mason's pulse pounded. Joel had brought her? Without warning? Joel sat across from him, eyes wide, like he already knew what was coming. Claire sat beside him, hands folded, calm like she was delivering a sermon. We need to talk, she said quietly. And you need to listen. Claire revealed more than Mason could process in one sitting. She confirmed Nolan's story, but with a chilling detail he hadn't known. The project didn't just monitor them, it changed them. Test subjects were intentionally pushed to extremes. Relationships were manipulated. Conflicts were orchestrated. Even acts of kindness were sometimes staged to see how they'd react. Daniels had eventually tried to blow the whistle, but the network was bigger than he imagined. It went beyond the shelter into public schools, probation offices, even adoption agencies. Claire said she left not because she was afraid, but because Daniels asked her to. He made her promise to keep watching from the outside, to stay close to Joel and protect him if anything happened. Mason's voice trembled with rage. So you used him too, he snapped. Joel said nothing. He just stared at the table, ashamed. That's when Claire gave Mason the ultimatum. The USB wasn't the only copy. There were others, stored in multiple locations. If Mason uploaded what he had now, if he exposed the network, it would draw out the people at the top. But they wouldn't come quietly. Claire said they'd target anyone tied to the data, Joel, Mason, even Lila if she was still alive. If he chose to go public, he'd need to disappear, erase himself from everything he knew, and go fully underground. Or, she said softly, you give it to me, and I'll make sure it ends quietly. No more kids get hurt. No more deaths. Just silence. Mason looked at Joel, at Claire, and for the first time, he didn't know what was real. His whole life had been manipulated by people who thought they were doing good. But silence wasn't justice. It was compliance. And yet, could he really sacrifice more lives, more of the people he cared about just to tell the truth? He reached into his jacket,
Pulled out the USB.
Held it between his fingers like it was a shard of glass. What if I already sent it? He asked. Claire's expression didn't change. But Joel flinched. And in that split second, Mason knew something else. Joel hadn't called him that night out of panic. He'd called him out of guilt. And Claire? She hadn't come to warn him. She came to stop him. The truth wasn't just inconvenient anymore, it was dangerous. And Mason was already too far in to walk away. Mason couldn't hear the hum of the diner anymore. The clatter of plates, the hiss of a coffee machine, the soft murmur of conversation. It all fell away like dead noise as the weight of Claire's silence bore down on him. The USB drive in his hand suddenly felt radioactive. Joel's flinch, the way his eyes had darted down and away like a child caught lying, it had said everything Mason needed to know. He wasn't just scared.
He was involved.
And not just by accident. Claire hadn't found Joel and manipulated him. Joel had been part of it from the start. The truth hit like a body blow. Joel, his closest friend, the one who'd grieved with him, grown up beside him, stood in the trenches during the darkest years of their childhood. He'd been feeding Claire everything. The calls, the missing files, the broken lock on Mason's door last week. It was all Joel. He'd given Claire the access codes, the surveillance locations, the fact that Mason still kept a burner laptop with his encrypted notes. Mason wanted to scream, but his mouth wouldn't work. He just sat there, blinking, trying to make sense of the years that suddenly felt hollow and staged. Claire leaned in, voice almost maternal, like she was soothing a child. You have no idea how far this goes, Mason. This isn't just about Daniels. Or the shelter. You think it stopped when he died?
No.
This program, it got greenlit. Fully funded. The same tactics, same manipulation, but now it's digital, silent, invisible. They don't need a shelter anymore. They've got data collection through school-issued tablets, social behavior tracking through meal card usage, parole compliance AI in juvenile courts. They're shaping entire lives before the kids even know who they are. And every time someone like you comes close to exposing it, someone else buries the story. Mason's skin turned cold. His heart pounded like it was trying to punch through his ribs. He had always thought the conspiracy ended when Daniels was found dead. He thought the shelter was the epicenter. But this was national. Funded. Sanitized behind the shield of youth development and behavioral science grants. Mason's shelter wasn't the first. It was just one in a series of experiments, one node in a system designed to test trauma as a method of control. He remembered a story he'd seen trending recently, a student protest about school surveillance cameras in public bathrooms. People thought it was just about privacy. It wasn't. It was monitoring. Predictive analytics disguised as safety measures. And suddenly it all fit. Claire slid a thin black envelope across the table. This is a full dossier on the next site, she said. Chicago. A charter school set to open next fall. But this time, they're involving local police. They'll be tracking behavioral microaggressions in real time. You could stop it, but only if you work with us. Do it the right way. Mason stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. Why are you giving me this now? He asked, his voice raw. If you've been trying to shut me down, why hand me more? Claire didn't answer. Instead, Joel did. Because they already know, Mason. Joel said, eyes finally locking with his. You made too much noise. The file you uploaded last week? The private server? It got flagged.
Tracked.
They're already moving on you. She's just giving you one last chance to flip the script. Take control of the story. Spin it before they do. Mason felt like the floor dropped out from under him. The drive hadn't been safe. Nothing had. The burner laptop. The encrypted backups. The late-night logins from cafe, Wi-Fi hotspots. All compromised. They'd let him believe he was ahead, just long enough for them to map his circle, his routines, his weaknesses. And now they were closing in. He grabbed the envelope, stuffed it in his jacket, stood up. You knew this whole time, he said to Joel, his voice shaking. You watched me nearly lose my mind trying to piece this together, and you sat there feeding them everything. You let them take Nolan. Joel stood too, but his face twisted with something that looked like regret. It wasn't supposed to go this far.
I thought, he paused.
I thought if I cooperated, they'd keep us safe. That you'd stop. That you'd let it go. Mason couldn't look at him anymore. He turned and walked out of the diner, heart pounding so loud it drowned out traffic. The sky outside was turning violet with dawn. And somewhere out there, someone was already prepping the next generation of invisible cages for kids who had no idea what was coming. He pulled out his phone and opened an app that shouldn't have existed. One Nolan had shown him in secret, a ghosted connection to a journalist who worked off-grid in Northern California. She specialized in exposing tech-based abuse, but no one had heard from her in 6 months. Mason didn't care. He typed one word and hit send. Ready. Behind him, in the diner window, Claire watched without blinking. Mason didn't know where he was going. His feet moved mechanically, taking him through darkened alleys and across desolate streets. The early morning light was creeping in, painting the sky in muted shades of purple and gold, but it offered no comfort. His mind was racing, too fast for him to keep up with, as the reality of what had happened to him and everyone around him crashed down like a wave. The weight of Joel's betrayal still hung heavily in his chest, a physical ache that made it hard to breathe. The idea that Joel, the one person he thought he could trust, had been working with Claire the entire time, feeding her information, setting him up, steering him into the lion's den, it was almost too much to bear. And yet, something in Mason snapped as the pieces fell into place. Claire, Joel, the files, the shelter, they were all part of a larger game. A game so much bigger than him. A game he wasn't even supposed to be a player in. But they had dragged him in, used him, manipulated him, and now he was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into a bottomless pit. The problem was, he still didn't know who was pulling the strings. Who was the real villain? Was it Claire, who was playing both sides, controlling the narrative, and using Joel as her pawn? Was it the people at the top, the ones funding the project, pulling the strings from behind a veil of bureaucracy and corporate agendas? Or was it someone closer to Mason than he could have ever imagined? Someone who was right there, in the shadows, watching him every step of the way. The final piece of the puzzle came to him in a flash. He had seen a name before, scribbled in the margins of one of the documents Joel had handed him weeks ago. A name he had dismissed as irrelevant, just another executive in a sea of faceless titles. But now, the name burned itself into his brain. David Thatcher. It was the same name listed on the contracts Mason had found at the shelter, the name signed off on funding requests, the same name that appeared on a network of shell corporations tied to government contractors. Thatcher was more than just an investor. He was the mastermind, the person who had orchestrated this entire experiment from the beginning, the one who had pulled all the strings and set the stage for everything that had happened. Thatcher was untouchable, hidden behind layers of protection, too smart, too powerful to ever get caught. But Mason had his proof, and it was time to make a choice. He knew the risks. He knew that going public would put him on a target list, expose him to the very people who had been watching him. But he didn't care anymore. His hands were shaking, but this time it wasn't fear. It was determination. He was done being a pawn in someone else's game. He was done being a spectator to a system that destroyed lives and manipulated the most vulnerable. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the screen lighting up with an encrypted message from the journalist in California. She had gotten the tip, the one he'd sent hours ago. The message simply read, "Ready. We go live tonight." Mason stood at the edge of the street, staring at the cracked screen of his phone. This was it. No more second chances. He wasn't going to let them erase his story. He wasn't going to let them erase the truth. But as he turned to head back to his apartment, a sharp noise broke through the silence, a faint click of a door opening behind him. Before he could react, he felt the cold press of a gun against his spine. His heart dropped, and for a moment, everything stopped. He slowly raised his hands, his mind racing through every possible scenario. He had been followed. They were closing in, and they weren't going to let him walk away this time. He turned slowly, facing the figure behind him. It was Claire, standing in the shadows, her expression unreadable. The gun was steady in her hands, but there was something else in her eyes, something like regret. "I didn't want it to go this far," she said, her voice quieter than Mason had ever heard it. "I tried to warn you. I really did." Mason didn't respond. He couldn't. The words wouldn't come, and the realization hit him harder than any betrayal could. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about power.
Control.
People like Claire, people who had been compromised, who had sold themselves for a cause they couldn't control anymore, they weren't the true enemy. The real enemy was the system they were working for, the machine that fed on lies and crushed anyone who got too close to the truth. He tried to move, but Claire's grip tightened on the gun. "Don't," she warned, her voice breaking. "They'll never stop. Not until they've destroyed everything." "I don't care," Mason said, finally finding his voice. "I'll burn it all down if I have to." At that moment, as if on cue, Mason's phone buzzed again, the encrypted message flashing across the screen. But this time, the message wasn't from the journalist. It was from Joel. "Don't do it. They're watching. They already know you've uploaded it." Mason's heart stopped. He looked up at Claire, her face pale, her eyes wide. She had been expecting this. She had been expecting him to make this move. And worse, she had been waiting for him to fail. Before Mason could process what was happening, the world around him seemed to collapse in on itself. From the shadows, a sleek black car screeched to a halt. The door flung open, and out stepped David Thatcher. His face was calm, too calm, like he had been anticipating this moment for years. The final twist in the game. The puppet master who had been pulling every string, orchestrating every move. "You really thought you could stop it?" Thatcher said, his voice smooth and cold. "You've already lost." And just like that, Mason understood. This wasn't about stopping a project. It wasn't even about exposing the truth. It was about survival, and the simple fact that there were some truths too powerful, too dangerous to reveal. Thatcher wasn't afraid of the truth coming out. He knew it wouldn't matter. People would be too scared, too confused, to understand. They'd label Mason a madman, a conspiracy theorist. He'd be nothing but a footnote in a history they'd rewrite. But Mason wasn't done yet. There was still one thing left he could do. He took a deep breath, locked eyes with Claire, and then with Thatcher, and finally, with the phone in his hand. He didn't upload it to the World Wide Web. He sent it somewhere else, a place no one could trace. The dark web, a hacker's paradise. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a weapon. "I'm not done," Mason whispered. And as the gun lowered and Claire's hand shook, it was clear to him now, this battle wasn't just about stopping one conspiracy. It was about starting a revolution. The screen on his phone flickered once more, and then everything went dark. Weeks passed, and Mason found himself in a place he never thought he'd be, the quiet aftermath of chaos. It wasn't peace, not by any means, but it was something different. Something he couldn't quite name. The world hadn't changed overnight. The conspiracy had been exposed, the documents released, the truth out there for anyone who wanted to see it. But the people behind it, David Thatcher, Claire, and the others, had disappeared like shadows in the night. The media frenzy, the investigations, it all came and went like a wave crashing onto the shore, only to recede into the background of the next big story. For all his efforts, Mason had become a brief headline, a fleeting whisper of a much larger, deeper reality. He wasn't a hero in the eyes of the public. He was a curiosity, a warning to those who dared to ask too many questions. And maybe, in a way, that was enough. Claire had vanished too, but Mason wasn't sure what to feel about it anymore. Was she a victim? A villain? A pawn or a player? He didn't know. There was no neat ending with her, no final showdown where good triumphed over evil. In the end, Claire was just another part of the broken system that Mason had learned to navigate. He thought about her often, though, wondering if she was still out there, still tangled in the web they had created together. He'd never get a clear answer, and he was starting to realize that was okay. Some questions didn't need answers. The footage Mason had sent to the dark web, it had spread like wildfire, but with no names attached. Anonymous. Untouchable. The truth was out there, but who would hear it?
Who would act on it?
It was a bitter pill to swallow, realizing how easily the world could move on, how quickly they could forget. Yet there was something satisfying in knowing he had done something. He had pulled back the curtain, shown people what lay behind it. That was the part he had to hold on to. The fact that he hadn't been silenced, hadn't been erased. For all the darkness, there had been a sliver of light. But as Mason sat there, his fingers tracing the edges of the coffee cup in front of him. Something in his gut told him this wasn't the end. It wasn't the end of the story, and it certainly wasn't the end of the people behind it all. They would regroup. They would rebuild. Power like theirs didn't just disappear. The war wasn't over. It was just starting. A small part of Mason, the part that still burned with the need for justice, knew he couldn't walk away, not yet. There were still more pieces to uncover, more truths to expose. But he was tired of fighting the same battle over and over, tired of the constant weight of a world that never seemed to learn. And then one day he got a letter. It was simple, unassuming, just a piece of folded paper with his name on the front, no return address. He opened it slowly, the familiar rush of adrenaline filling his veins. Inside, there was a single line of text. "You've been watching. Now it's your turn." The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the room seemed to grow colder. He couldn't place it. He couldn't understand why, but something about it felt different. This wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation. An invitation to something bigger, something darker. The power brokers had been quiet for too long. This was their way of reminding him that he was still a part of their game, whether he liked it or not. But Mason didn't immediately react. He didn't throw the letter away or burn it or make any rash moves. Instead, he tucked it into his jacket pocket, his mind working overtime. He wasn't naive enough to think this was over, but he wasn't ready to play their game again.
Not yet.
He had his moment of truth, his moment of exposure, and for the first time in a long while, he could breathe. The choice was his now, whether to dive back into the shadows or walk away. The world continued around him, oblivious to the quiet war that raged beneath its surface. The story, for all its twists and turns, had left its mark on Mason, but in the grand scheme of things, it was just another ripple in an ocean of unseen battles. Was he done? Could he ever be done? The question echoed in his mind like a distant drumbeat, calling him back to something he knew would never truly leave him. And so, as Mason stood up and walked out of the small cafe, the letter still tucked away in his coat pocket, he realized something that stayed with him. The truth had changed him, but it had also broken him. The world had its own way of hiding the darkness, and no matter how many times the truth came to light, it would always find a way to slip back into the shadows. The game was never truly over. And maybe, just maybe, that was the price of knowing too much. As the door swung shut behind him, Mason felt the weight of everything he had learned. But it didn't matter anymore. The truth, like everything else, was fleeting. The choices we make, the things we uncover, they never fully go away. The story would live on in whispers, in rumors, in the dark corners of the web. And Mason? Well, he would carry it with him, forever, no matter where he went. The final twist was simple. The game was still being played, and Mason had unknowingly set the next round in motion. The question was no longer whether he could escape. The question was whether anyone could.